By 1942, Nazi Germany stood at the height of its power. Much of Europe had already fallen under German control, and Adolf Hitler believed that total victory was only a matter of time. His focus shifted toward the Soviet Union, not only as an enemy to be defeated, but as a resource-rich territory that could fuel Germany's war machine. The oil fields of the Caucasus were critical to this strategy, and control of major transport routes in southern Russia would allow Germany to dominate supply lines across the region. Stalingrad became a central target in this plan. The city sat along the Volga River, one of the most important transportation arteries in the Soviet Union. It was a major industrial center, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the Red Army. Beyond its strategic value, the city also carried symbolic importance. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin, making it a political and psychological prize as much as a military objective. Capturing Stalingrad would represent both a strategic victory and a propaganda triumph, sending a message that even the heart of Soviet power could be broken. In the summer of 1942, German forces launched their offensive towards southern Russia. Massive armored units advanced across open terrain, supported by artillery and air power. Entire divisions moved steadily eastward, pushing Soviet forces back and creating the impression of another inevitable German victory. The speed and scale of the advance overwhelmed many defensive positions, and the road to Stalingrad gradually opened. As German forces approached the city, the Luftwaffe began a sustained bombing campaign. Air raids struck residential districts, industrial zones, transport hubs, and civilian infrastructure. Fires spread across neighborhoods, and entire blocks of buildings collapsed. Thousands of civilians were killed in the bombardments, and tens of thousands were left homeless. Hospitals, schools, and factories were reduced to rubble. Within days, Stalingrad was transformed from a functioning industrial city into a shattered landscape of ruins, smoke, and debris. Despite the destruction, the city did not collapse. Soviet leadership understood the importance of holding Stalingrad, both strategically and symbolically. Orders were issued to defend the city at all costs. Retreat was not considered an option. Transport boats were frequently destroyed mid-crossing, and many soldiers never reached the city. Nevertheless, troops continued to arrive, often poorly equipped and inadequately trained, but driven by strict orders and the knowledge that retreat meant execution or imprisonment. As German forces entered the city, they encountered conditions they were not prepared for. The ruins of Stalingrad eliminated the advantages of speed, armor, and long-range firepower. Tanks struggled to move through debris-filled streets. Artillery was limited by the close proximity of enemy positions. The battlefield became fragmented into small, isolated zones of control. Buildings, factories, and apartment blocks turned into fortified positions. Each structure had to be taken individually, often at extreme cost. Combat shifted into close-quarters warfare. Soldiers fought inside stairwells, corridors, basements, and factory halls. Engagements took place at distances of a few meters, sometimes only a few feet. Control of a single building could change hands multiple times in a single day. Snipers operated from rooftops and upper floors, turning every open space into a death zone. The ruined city created an environment where visibility was limited, movement was dangerous, and survival depended on constant alertness. The The German army, trained for rapid offensives and mobile warfare, found itself trapped in a slow, grinding urban conflict. Progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. Entire units were exhausted simply trying to secure small sections of ruined streets. Supply lines became increasingly strained as fighting intensified and infrastructure collapsed. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies became harder to deliver to frontline troops. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders adapted to the terrain. They learned to use the ruins as cover, creating defensive positions within collapsed buildings and underground spaces. Factories, such as the Red October and Tractor Factory, became major battle zones where production facilities were turned into fortresses. Workers often fought alongside soldiers, defending the very structures they had once worked in. By the early stages of the Battle for Stalingrad, Stalingrad had ceased to function as a normal city. It had become a dense, chaotic battlefield where neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Both armies suffered heavy losses. The Germans advanced slowly but steadily, while the Soviets lost ground but refused to collapse. The battle transformed into a test of endurance rather than movement, strength rather than speed, and survival rather than strategy. As winter approached, conditions worsened for both sides. The fighting continued without pause, and the physical and psychological toll on soldiers increased daily. What began as a strategic campaign to capture a key city was evolving into a prolonged struggle of attrition, where victory would depend not on rapid conquest, but on the ability to endure suffering longer than the enemy. At this stage, the Battle for Stalingrad had already become one of the most brutal urban conflicts in history. However, the worst phase of the battle was still ahead. The full scale of human suffering, starvation, psychological collapse, and mass death had not yet reached its peak. The city was now locked in a cycle of violence that would only intensify as winter tightened its grip, and both armies became increasingly trapped inside the ruins. As the battle dragged on, Stalingrad entered its most brutal phase. What had once been a military campaign became a prolonged struggle for survival. The ruined city offered no shelter, no safety, and no stability. Soldiers on both sides lived inside collapsed buildings, underground cellars, broken factories, and open rubble fields. There were no proper defensive lines anymore. The battlefield had dissolved into a chaotic maze of destruction where danger existed in every direction. Winter arrived with extreme force. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and the city became covered in snow and ice. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, and frostbite became as deadly as bullets. Weapons froze, vehicles failed, medical supplies were limited. Wounded men often froze to death before they could receive treatment. The cold affected everything: movement, morale, and the ability to fight. Food shortages became severe. Supply lines were unreliable and often destroyed by enemy fire. Soldiers survived on minimal rations, sometimes eating frozen scraps, spoiled food, or anything they could find in the ruins. Starvation weakened bodies and slowed reactions. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters and underground spaces. Dysentery, infections, and untreated wounds became common. Medical care was primitive, and many injured soldiers were simply left to die. The psychological toll was devastating. Continuous artillery bombardment, constant gunfire, and the permanent threat of sudden death destroyed morale. Soldiers suffered from exhaustion, fear, and mental breakdowns. Sleep was rare. Silence was almost non-existent. Many soldiers lived in a state of permanent anxiety, unable to relax even for a moment. The stress of constant danger caused hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional collapse. Urban combat intensified as both sides adapted to the environment. Fighting took place inside buildings, across staircases, through holes in walls, and between floors of collapsed structures. Rooms were entered with grenades before soldiers followed. Corridors were death traps. Basements became ambush zones. Entire squads could be wiped out within seconds in enclosed spaces. Every movement carried the risk of immediate death. Snipers became a dominant force in the battle. Soviet snipers used the ruins to create hidden firing positions in rubble, rooftops, and broken windows. They operated patiently, waiting for hours or even days for a single target. German soldiers learned to fear open spaces, windows, and exposed streets. Moving without cover became almost impossible. The psychological effect of sniper warfare was extreme. Soldiers felt constantly watched and hunted. Fear of invisible death created paranoia and hesitation in movement. The city itself became a weapon. Dust clouds reduced visibility. Rubble blocked escape routes. Fires created smoke screens. Underground tunnels and basements allowed sudden attacks from unexpected directions. The ruined infrastructure created an environment where traditional military formations no longer functioned. The battle was no longer fought by large units, but by small groups and individuals fighting for control of isolated positions. Factories became some of the most violent battle zones. Industrial complexes such as the Red October factory and the tractor factory were turned into massive fortresses. Fighting inside these buildings was continuous. Machines, conveyors, and production halls became cover and killing zones. Workers who had once built equipment there now fought inside the same structures. The line between civilian and soldier disappeared completely. Losses increased rapidly. Bodies accumulated in streets, buildings, and underground spaces. Many were never buried. Rats fed on corpses. The smell of death filled the air. In some areas, the dead were used as cover because there was nothing else to hide behind. The presence of constant death became normalized. Soldiers stopped reacting emotionally. Survival became mechanical, driven by instinct rather than thought. German forces began to experience severe logistical problems. Ammunition and food supplies were limited. Fuel shortages affected vehicles and heating equipment. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Many wounded soldiers remained in the ruins, untreated. The German command structure struggled to maintain coordination in the fragmented battlefield. Communication lines were frequently cut. Units became isolated. Orders were delayed or never arrived. At the same time, Soviet forces adapted more effectively to the environment. They used short-range combat tactics, night attacks, and sudden ambushes. They learned the terrain intimately, moving through rubble and underground spaces with familiarity. Defensive positions were built inside destroyed structures, making them difficult to detect and eliminate. The Soviet strategy focused on exhausting the enemy rather than defeating them through rapid attacks. The battle became a war of attrition. Progress was measured in casualties rather than territory. Both sides lost thousands of men for minimal gains. Control of a single building could cost hundreds of lives. Entire battalions were destroyed for minimal strategic advantage. The meaning of victory changed from advancement to survival. Morale on both sides deteriorated. Soldiers no longer believed in quick victory. Hope faded. Survival became the only objective. Letters from home stopped arriving. Many soldiers believed they would never leave the city alive.
The battlefield created a sense of isolation from the rest of the world, as if Stalingrad had become a closed system of violence disconnected from reality.
As winter deepened, the suffering increased. The cold intensified starvation. Starvation intensified disease. Disease intensified death. The physical environment and human suffering combined into a continuous cycle of destruction. The city itself seemed to consume life. By this stage of the battle, Stalingrad had become more than a military objective. It had transformed into a symbol of endurance, suffering, and psychological collapse. Both armies were trapped in a space where retreat was impossible and victory was uncertain. The city had become a prison of ruins, fire, and frozen ground. However, beneath the chaos, a strategic shift was forming. While German forces were focused on urban fighting, Soviet command was preparing a large-scale counteroffensive outside the city. Massive troop movements were being organized beyond the ruins. Supply lines, reserves, and armored units were being positioned for a coordinated strike. The German army, exhausted, weakened, and overextended, remained unaware of the scale of what was being prepared. The battle inside the city continued to drain men, resources, and morale, while a larger operation was silently taking shape beyond the ruins. Stalingrad was no longer just a battlefield. It was becoming a trap.